All eyes are on the G20 summit that New Delhi will host this weekend. And ahead of that, we're at the UN House to understand what the United Nations priorities are and what their key recommendations for the G20 nations will be. We're honored to have with us the UN Secretary General Spokesperson, Mr. Stephane Dujarric. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us. First things first, what do you think about India's presidency of the G20? The summit is here. We're 1 day away from the summit. What do you think about India's presidency and what are your hopes from this G20 summit?
Well, the presidency comes at a very critical time because we're in a very difficult time in the world. India is a leading voice in the global south, but India is also a bridge builder politically, geographically, and the themes put forward for this G20 of one family, one earth, one planet are exactly what we need at this time. We live in an increasingly multipolar world, which in itself is not a bad thing, but what we risk and what we fear is a fracture. A great fracture between different blocks. And what we need from the G20 is a single voice, is trying to bring that world back together.
Right. So from the United Nations perspective, sir, what do you think would be the priorities that you would be looking at? Of course, sustainability is one. Climate change has been talked about repeatedly, and that's going to be a focus along with sustainable development and not just economic growth in terms of GDP. So from the UN Secretary General's office, what can you tell us about the priorities from the UN's perspective?
I think the Secretary General will come with two very simple messages on climate and on sustainable development. And that is that we cannot continue with the world the way it is right now, in terms of what we're seeing on climate, in terms of what we're seeing on development. On climate, we just learned that we lived through the hottest summer on record. And it's very important for the Secretary General to be here with very strong messages on climate, with a real I hate to use the word wake-up call because we've been trying to shake political leaders for a long time now. But exactly. So you kind of need to keep doing it. And if you notice, the Secretary General's language is increasingly strident on climate. The G20 brings together the biggest emitters in the world. 80% of emissions come from G20 countries. So if these political leaders around the table don't have the courage to take the necessary decisions, we're in big trouble. But, we still have time to change course. We still have time to mitigate what is happening with climate. On sustainable development, the Secretary General, I think, is extremely worried that because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine, the world has gone through a number of severe shocks, and the sustainable development goals are not on track to be met by 2030. He is calling for a $500 million sort of jumpstart stimulus package for the sustainable development. And I think what I know he's also calling for is a reform of the international financial architecture. I think it is very clear that the World Bank, the IMF, all the Bretton Woods institutions were created in an architecture that was based on the world in 1945. The world has evolved, as you well know, and so we need to see that architecture change. We need to see the World Bank and the IMF shareholders allow the banks to take greater risks, to give more investment to developing countries, to help us all, really.
Right, and as you mentioned that we're living in a multipolar world, there are so many geopolitical tensions on multiple fronts, not just one. So if we can address the elephant in the room now, what do you think is the possibility of coming to a joint statement in such a scenario when so many countries aren't on the same page on so many facets?
Well, we very much hope that the Indian leadership will guide the 19 other members to a joint statement. It is very important to have that single voice and that single statement come out. And we know that member states, the members of the G20, are hard at work on that.
Right. So the Indian side is confident. There was just a press conference by the External Affairs Ministry, and they said that the joint statement is ready. The New Delhi Declaration, as it has been called, it's ready. It's going to be handed over to the leaders, and they are confident that the leaders are going to accept it. Are you confident? Do you have any sense as of now on What do you think? Can there be a joint statement this time? Because for the last few meetings, we've seen these countries can't come together on one.
We can't tell the future, but we are participating as observers in a lot of these discussions. But ultimately, it'll be up to the G20 leaders, the leaders of the 20 largest economies in the world, who have, of course, a very large political voice as well, and we very much hope that they will come together.
So what do you think India can do to make this happen, to make a joint statement possible? What do you think India's role in making a joint statement possible can be?
I mean, I think it's not for us to tell India what the Indian Foreign Ministry, Indian Prime Minister, what they have to do. What we rely on is, I think, the wisdom of the Indian leadership and their experience as bridge builders.
Right. So from the Indian side, if let's consider a possibility, if there's a joint statement, considering what the Indian side is saying that that's a possibility, then how transformational do you think it would be for the world at large, considering geopolitical tensions, considering climate change? So how transformational could a joint statement prove for the world economy at large?
I mean, I think it'll be a very important step, but what will be more important, in a sense, is what's in the statement.
So that's still, we don't know much about it, the New Delhi Declaration. My last question to you, sir, one topic that's slightly off G20, but that has been much talked about here in India, and that is something that has happened in other countries as well. The talk of changing the country's official name from India to Bharat.
Right.
What does the UN think about that?
Well, it's not for us to tell countries how they want to be called in official settings. We've seen other countries inform the UN that they want their name changed and how they refer to, but this is a question for Indians themselves to decide.
So several countries have changed their names, and if India does it, that won't be completely new.
Well, I mean, we've seen it throughout history. We know that countries have changed names. They all have their internal processes to do that. Countries then inform us that this process has taken place, and we act upon it.
Right. Can you give us a preview of what the Secretary General would be speaking about today? Last question.
Well, I mean, it's sort of what I highlighted already. I think it's his strong message to the leaders, the fact that we live in a very dangerous moment, and that he is very fearful of a fracture, right, of two groups or three groups of nations with separate economic systems, separate approaches to things like artificial intelligence, to technology, separate approaches to how to fight climate change. I mean, right now, the challenges that we all face, right, if you look at technology and artificial intelligence, if you look at climate change, if you look at global health pandemic, how can anyone think that you can solve these problems by not bringing the whole world together?
These countries that make up around more than 80% of the global GDP and emissions. Thanks very much, Mr. Stephane, for speaking to us.
Take care.
Thanks very much. So as you heard from the UN Secretary General's spokesperson, that their priorities for the G20 this time, sustainability, climate change, and sustainable economic growth. Along with that, an important word coming in that India is seen as a bridge builder, and of course all eyes on whether a joint statement will be agreed on. In New Delhi, with camera person Ashwini Mehra, Priyanshi Sharma for NDTV.